The chandelier lights above me were blinding, bouncing off crystal glasses and polished marble, while I stood pressed against the wall, my hands folded too tightly in front of my dress. The room smelled like expensive perfume and champagne, but all I could feel was the cold creeping up my spine as I realized I wasn't meant to be seen. I had been brought here, but carefully hidden, like an inconvenience wrapped in silk. If you've ever felt invisible standing right next to the person who was supposed to protect you, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. Stories like this happen more often than we admit. As applause rippled across the room, I understood this wasn't just embarrassment, it was practice. Years of learning how to disappear quietly, how to survive by taking up less space. I didn't know it yet, but that night planted the first crack in everything I thought my life was. That was the moment everything began to unravel. I was standing beneath crystal lights in a Chicago ballroom when I realized I had already been erased. The room shimmered with confidence and money, but I was guided to the edges, positioned where shadows did the work of hiding me. I remember the weight of my navy dress against my skin, simple and neat, and how suddenly it felt like proof that I did not belong. I learned to stand still in those moments, shoulders angled inward, hands folded tight, breathing shallow enough that no one noticed me taking up space. Around me, laughter floated easily, glasses clinked, and names that carried influence moved freely through the air. I stayed silent, not because I had nothing to say, but because silence had kept me safe for years. This was not the first time I had been tucked away to protect an image. It was simply the most public. I had spent decades shrinking myself, learning how to disappear without causing discomfort, convincing myself that survival sometimes looked like obedience. That night, humiliation settled quietly in my chest, heavy and familiar. Yet beneath it, something else stirred. The room felt different, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I did not know why then, only that the pattern I lived inside was about to be disturbed, forever changed. I used to think what happened at that gala was just one bad moment. The truth is, it was only visible because everything else was hidden, behind closed doors. My life had been narrowed so slowly that I barely noticed when it became small. Money was never discussed as a shared resource. It arrived as permission. Each month, I was given $200 and told to make it work, as if budgeting were a personal virtue test. Groceries, clothes, gifts, anything that made life feel human had to be justified in advance. I learned how to explain my needs before I even felt them. If I wanted to visit my parents, I prepared reasons. If I wanted a book, I weighed whether curiosity was worth the discomfort it might cause. Over time, I stopped wanting much at all. Wanting felt dangerous. At the time, I called this structure. I told myself it was safety, that someone else carrying the weight of decisions meant I could rest. I confused control with care because it was quieter than anger and easier than loneliness. My world shrank year by year. Rooms became routines. Opinions became smiles. Dreams became something I remembered instead of something I reached for. I did not notice myself disappearing because disappearance happened in inches, not leaps. Standing in that ballroom, hidden and small, I realized this life had gone unquestioned for so long that it felt permanent. I did not yet know it was about to be disrupted. That certainty was the quiet cage I lived inside without resistance then. At some point, the room stopped feeling loud. I did not notice it all at once. It happened the way pressure changes before a storm. Conversations softened. Laughter lost its edge. Even the music seemed to pull back, as if the space itself were making room for something unspoken. I straightened without meaning to. My awareness sharpened. People near me shifted their posture, eyes turning in the same direction, though no one announced why. It felt as if an invisible line had been drawn across the ballroom, dividing before and after. I stayed still, watching reflections move across polished floors and crystal glass. My hands went cold around the water I was holding. I could feel attention passing over me and then, unexpectedly, stopping. That sensation was unfamiliar. I had grown used to being overlooked. The air felt heavier, charged. Every instinct I had learned to quiet suddenly woke up. I became aware of my breathing, of my spine, of the way my heart began to press harder against my ribs. I told myself it meant nothing, that I was imagining significance where there was none, and yet I felt seen, not glanced at, not measured, but truly noticed. It was unsettling and strangely grounding at the same time. I did not understand who was looking at me or why, only that the gaze carried history, weight, and intent. For the first time that night, I lifted my eyes fully. Across the room, someone from a life I thought was buried was staring directly at me, and the past was suddenly very close. When my name reached me, it did not sound like a label. It sounded like a memory. The way it was carried across the space held care, familiarity, something I had not felt attached to myself in years. I froze. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. My chest tightened. My hands went warm, and for a brief moment I forgot where I was standing. I had grown used to being addressed indirectly, spoken around, reduced to a role instead of a person. Hearing my name felt like being touched after years of numbness. I realized then how long it had been since anyone had said it without expectation or control attached. That single word cracked something open. Images stirred that I had trained myself not to visit: classrooms, laughter. A younger version of me who spoke freely and believed her thoughts mattered. At the same time, I felt the shift beside me, the familiar tension of possession, sharp and cold, reminding me of the space I was supposed to occupy. I did not turn. I did not need to. I knew that awareness well. It was the presence that had taught me to shrink, but the gaze on me did not release. Whoever stood across the room was not seeing the version of me shaped by fear. They were seeing someone I used to be, someone I had buried to survive. For the first time in decades, the past felt awake, and with my name echoing inside me, I understood I had not been forgotten at all. I used to be someone who took up space without apology. Before fear taught me restraint, I was curious, talkative, and deeply alive to possibility. I loved books that asked hard questions and mornings that smelled like cheap coffee and hope. I believed effort mattered and that kindness could shape a future. In my early 20s, my dreams felt practical and bold at the same time. I wanted to teach, to sit with children as they discovered language and realized their thoughts had weight. I imagined a life built on conversation, purpose, and shared growth. I did not measure myself by status. I measured myself by meaning. Back then, love felt safe. It arrived quietly, through listening and presence, not pressure. I remember the relief of being heard without correction, of having my opinions met with interest instead of dismissal. I felt chosen for who I was, not managed for how I appeared. That safety allowed me to soften rather than brace. Looking back, I can see how open I was, how unguarded. I trusted the world to meet me with fairness because it had, until then. I did not yet understand how threatening a woman's independence could be to those who valued control more than connection. Those years live inside me as a steady warmth, even now. But they also carry a shadow. because just beyond that season of possibility, forces were gathering that would decide my life for me, and the version of myself I cherished was not meant to survive unchanged. I did not know how quickly silence would replace joy, or how survival would slowly teach me to call disappearance maturity and safety instead of freedom. That love grew naturally, without strategy or performance. It felt balanced in a way I had never experienced before. I was not managed or molded. I was met. My thoughts were treated as equal weight, my dreams as something to protect, not contain. For the first time, partnership felt like standing side by side instead of being led. We talked about the future as something we would build together, not inherited, not enforced, chosen. That alone made it dangerous. I did not understand it then, only that the more secure I felt emotionally, the more subtle tension crept into the edges of that happiness. I began to notice how our connection was evaluated by people who had never asked how it felt. Questions shifted from who we were to where we came from what we valued to what we represented. Love, I learned, was being measured against balance sheets and bloodlines. There was an unspoken message in the air whenever power entered the room. I could feel it in the way conversations tightened, in the way my independence was suddenly framed as naive instead of admirable. I sensed judgment, not of my character, but of my suitability. That was when unease replaced ease, not because the love changed, but because I realized it existed in opposition to something much larger. I was not just choosing a partner. I was crossing an invisible boundary set by people who believed legacy mattered more than happiness. I did not yet know who would step forward to enforce that belief. I only knew the safety I felt had been noticed, and that realization carried weight. Love had become a threat, and threats invite response. I remember the office more than the words, the height of the windows, the weight of the desk, the way the air felt thinner the longer I sat there. Everything in that room was designed to remind me I was small and easily replaced. I was not spoken to as a person. I was evaluated as a risk. My education, my scholarship, my future plans were laid out as fragile privileges, things that could be removed with a single decision. I felt my chest tighten as I understood how little protection I actually had. Then the threats widened. It was no longer just about me. The life I loved was pulled into that space and held up as leverage. I realized how exposed he was, how completely vulnerable his future would be if I refused to comply. Power does not need to raise its voice to be terrifying. It only needs to be specific, inside me. Fear fought with instinct. Every part of me wanted to run, to warn him, to resist. And then another truth surfaced, one I had barely allowed myself to acknowledge. I was carrying a life that depended on my choices, a future that could be destroyed before it even began. That knowledge shattered me. There was no version of bravery that saved everyone. There was only damage control. I understood, with sick clarity, that love had placed us both in danger. I left that office having made a decision that was never offered as a choice. I would disappear. I would break my own heart to protect his future and the fragile life inside me. By the time the door closed behind me, the woman I had been no longer existed, and the silence ahead felt unavoidable. It followed me long after I stepped outside. After that decision, everything went quiet. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind that presses in on you and leaves no room to breathe. I carried the loss alone, privately, because it felt too fragile to explain and too painful to justify. Grief became something I managed instead of something I shared. Time passed, but it did not heal me. It simply moved forward while I stayed still. Friends drifted away. Conversations felt exhausting. I learned how to smile just enough to avoid questions and how to keep my voice steady when my chest felt hollow. Silence became my shelter. The loss changed my relationship with hope. I stopped imagining futures. I stopped trusting joy. Being alone began to feel dangerous, not because I needed someone to save me, but because the quiet left me alone with memories I did not know how to survive. That was when the offer of safety appeared. It did not come wrapped in passion or excitement. It came as reliability, predictability, and the promise that I would not have to face the world by myself. I said yes, not because my heart was full, but because it was tired. I told myself love could grow later. I told myself stability mattered more than happiness. What I did not admit was that I was choosing numbness over pain and calling it maturity. That marriage settled into my life like a structure built around exhaustion. It asked very little of me emotionally, and I gave even less of myself in return. I survived inside it by staying quiet, believing safety was enough. I did not realize then that this silence would one day demand to be broken. I carried that truth for decades like a sealed room inside my chest. When the moment came to open it, my fear was not of pain, but of disbelief. I had learned that silence was safer than explaining choices no one wanted to understand. I spoke slowly, not to persuade, but to survive the telling. I let the years unfold as they were, without defending myself. I named the threats, the impossible bargain, the decision made under pressure that felt like erasure. I admitted the cost I paid in quiet ways, and the reasons I disappeared. As the truth left me, something loosened. I was not interrupted by doubt or corrected by suspicion. I felt the rare relief of being received. For the first time, my silence was understood as protection, not abandonment. That shift changed how I saw myself. The shame I had carried softened. I could see the young woman I was with, compassion instead of judgment. I had not failed anyone. I had done the best I could inside a narrow corridor of choices. Hope did not arrive as a promise. It arrived as steadiness. The knowledge that support offered could be accepted freely, not owed, that I could choose what came next. Yet even in that relief, a thread tugged at me. Some parts of the past still did not align. There were gaps my story could not explain, shadows that suggested another hand at work. The truth had been spoken, but not all of it, and I felt a deeper betrayal waiting to be named. I thought the truth had finally settled, but it kept moving. As details surfaced, the past rearranged itself into something colder. I learned that the silence around me had not been accidental. It had been maintained. He knew people had looked for me. He knew questions had been asked, calls made, paths followed, and each time, he redirected them. Information was altered. Leads were closed. I had not vanished. I had been hidden. That realization hit with a clarity that hurt more than confusion ever had. What I called protection was control, refined over years. He had not loved me enough to let me choose. He had owned me enough to decide for everyone else. The shock hardened into anger, sharp and steady. I could trace how dependency had been engineered, how isolation was framed as loyalty, how my past was sealed away so I could never compare the life I had to the one I lost. Then came the moment that stripped away any remaining doubt. When I challenged him internally, I felt the edge of threat beneath the calm, not concern, not fear for me, fear of losing possession. That was when I understood staying was no longer about endurance. It was about danger. Love does not require erasure. Safety does not demand obedience. The door inside me closed quietly. With that clarity, My decision was already made. Leaving was no longer betrayal. Staying would have been destruction. I did not leave in a rush. The panic that used to live in my chest had gone quiet, replaced by something steadier. The decision was already made, and that calm told me it was real. I moved through the house as if it belonged to someone else. I chose only what mattered, my hands steady, my thoughts clear. Every step felt heavy, but it was no longer paralyzing. Fear stayed behind me like a shadow I refused to turn toward. I noticed how silence followed me from room to room. The control that once filled the air felt thinner, weaker, as if it already knew it had lost. I was not sneaking away. I was reclaiming myself. When I reached the door, I paused, not because I doubted, but because I needed to mark the moment. Crossing that threshold meant accepting uncertainty, consequences, and the truth that I could survive them. Outside, the air felt unfamiliar and honest. My heart was still racing, but relief moved through it too. For the first time in years, my future was unwritten. I walked forward carrying fear, relief, and resolve together, knowing whatever came next would be faced on my own terms. After I left, I expected chaos. I waited for threats, for retaliation, for the familiar tightening in my chest. Instead, something quieter happened. Reality set in. I did not chase revenge. I did not make dramatic demands. I focused on staying safe, on breathing, on rebuilding a sense of normal that had been missing for years. While I was doing that, other forces began moving without me pushing them. Questions were asked, records were reviewed, patterns that had been hidden behind charm and authority started to surface. What I had lived with privately did not stay private anymore. It moved into systems designed to handle facts, not fear. What struck me most was how impersonal it all felt. No shouting, no confrontation, just consequences unfolding step by step. Power did not disappear in a single moment, but it loosened its grip until it could no longer reach me. I realized then that justice is not the same as revenge. Revenge demands your energy. Justice does not. Justice happens while you are busy protecting your dignity and your life. The fear that once dictated every decision slowly faded. I slept without listening for footsteps. I spoke without rehearsing explanations. Control shifted, not because I fought for dominance, but because I chose distance. For the first time, safety felt real, and it belonged to me. Freedom did not arrive as a rush of joy. It arrived as quiet mornings in a small apartment that finally felt like mine. The furniture was simple. The silence was kind. I could sit at the table and decide my day without asking permission or calculating consequences. I started with ordinary choices: what to cook, when to sleep, which window to open. Each decision seemed small, but together they rebuilt a sense of trust I had lost in myself. I learned that my instincts were not reckless. They were simply unused. Work returned next, not as ambition, but as purpose. I found my way back to the kind of work I once dreamed of doing, work that asked me to think, to care, to contribute. It reminded me that my value had never been tied to control or approval. It had always lived in what I could create. There were moments when fear resurfaced, brief and sharp, but they no longer ruled me. Calm began lasting longer than panic. My body learned that it was safe to rest. Healing was not dramatic. It was repetitive. It showed up in routines, in steady paychecks, in evenings that ended without dread. Slowly, a self I recognized started to return. I practiced listening to myself daily, forgiving mistakes, trusting progress, and allowing patience to replace urgency without pressure or fear. For the first time, I felt whole enough to choose what came next. After rebuilding myself, I did not rush back toward love. I approached it carefully, aware of how easily fear can disguise itself as connection. I knew what I would never accept again, and that clarity felt like strength, not caution. When love returned, it did not arrive as a promise to fix me. It showed up as curiosity, respect, and space. I was invited, not pulled. I was asked, not assumed. For the first time, commitment felt like a choice I could walk toward freely or decline without consequence. A proposal came quietly, without spectacle. It was framed as an offer, not a solution. I said yes because I wanted to, not because I was afraid of being alone. That distinction changed everything. We planned a small wedding shaped by intention. Every detail reflected agency, where we stood, who we invited, how we promised ourselves to each other as equals, with room to grow independently. Love no longer defined my worth. It complemented a life I had already claimed as my own. I entered partnership whole, grounded, and awake. Standing there, I understood something simple and profound. Love is safest when it is chosen daily, freely, and without surrendering yourself. It feels like peace built slowly, honestly, and held by two people who remain whole together by conscious mutual choice. I spent years believing safety meant silence and endurance. I confused control with care and fear with loyalty. What this journey taught me is simpler and harder at the same time. Love does not require erasure. Protection is not ownership, and peace never comes from shrinking yourself. Looking back, I do not carry bitterness. I carry understanding. I see a woman who made the best choices she could with the information and fear she had. Survival is not failure. Silence is not weakness. Sometimes it is the only way to stay alive until choice returns. If any part of this story feels familiar, I want you to know this. You are not broken. You are not late. And you are not wrong for wanting both safety and joy. Boundaries are not cruelty. They are clarity. Love that asks you to disappear is not love. Growth did not happen all at once for me. It arrived through honesty, support, and the courage to listen inward. Over time, fear loosened and self-trust replaced it. Thank you for staying with this story and holding it with care. If you feel comfortable, I invite you to share your thoughts or experiences in the comments. Your voice matters, and connection begins with being seen. We heal faster when we realize our lives are allowed to belong to us, fully, without apology or permission, ever.